The first time Eli Blackthorne saw her, she wasn't walking so much as dragging herself across the hard-packed desert trail, each step leaving a darker stain of blood on the dust. Her skirts were torn, a hem flapping loose like a battle flag, shredded by bullets. The setting sun burned the horizon in blood orange and crimson, so that for a heartbeat Eli thought the whole canyon was aflame. He squinted against the glow and shifted his weight on the porch rail of his cabin, knowing deep in his bones that the quiet life he'd built was about to be shattered. She staggered closer, clutching at her side, her boots mismatched and worn through at the solace. Her face was pale beneath the dirt smeared across her cheeks, but her eyes startlingly clear, a deep hazel that caught what was left of the daylight, were filled with something Eli knew all too well: desperation. He stepped down into the dirt. Yard, his boots crunching gravel, and she tried to quicken her pace, but her body gave out before she reached him. With a strangled cry, she crumpled into the dust just beyond the wooden gate, one hand stretched out as though begging the earth itself to help her. Eli was on her in 3 long strides. "Easy," he muttered, lowering himself beside her. His voice was steady low, the voice of a man who had soothed horses more than people. "Save your strength." She tried to speak, but only managed a broken whisper. "Don't let them find me." Those words froze Eli's blood like ice, watered down his spine. He had lived long enough in these badlands to know the meaning behind such a plea. Somebody was after her men who would ride the desert until their horses collapsed if it meant finishing the hunt. And now, if she crossed his threshold, her fight would become his dot still. Eli couldn't walk away. Not from someone so clearly broken. He slipped an arm beneath her shoulders and eased her up. She gasped at the movement, a sharp sound of pain tearing from her lips. Her ankle was twisted beneath her, swollen and raw where the leather of her boot had rubbed the skin bloody. "You'll bleed yourself dry if I leave you out here," Eli said gruffly. He lifted her into his arms with ease. For a man hardened by years of gunfights and cattle drives, she weighed no more than a sack of feathers. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of smoke and sage. A single lamp flickered on the rough-hewn table, casting shadows against the log walls. He laid her down gently on his bedroll in the corner, brushing away his hat brim with one calloused hand. She clutched at his sleeve with surprising strength, forcing his gaze back to hers. You don't know what they'll do," she whispered, breath hitching. Eli's jaw tightened. "Then you'd better tell me who they are." "But—" Her eyes rolled back, exhaustion claiming her before she could answer. Eli sat back on his heels, the firelight catching on the long scar across his cheek, a scar that had made strangers cross streets to avoid him. He had built this cabin on the far edge of Deadwood Canyon for one reason: to escape the endless cycle of violence that had consumed his younger years. Yet here was trouble, bleeding on his bedroll, breathing in his house, dragging him back into the world he had sworn to leave behind. He tended her ankle with water drawn from the clay jug, washing away blood and grit until the wound looked less like a battlefield and more like skin again. He bound it with a strip of clean linen torn from his own shirt, his hands gentle for all their size. She stirred faintly, murmuring something he couldn't catch. Only the name Clara escaped her lips before she drifted into uneasy sleep. Outside, the coyotes began their mournful howls, echoing across the canyon like a dirge. Eli leaned against the doorframe, staring out into the darkness. The desert night was wide and endless, but it didn't feel empty. Somewhere beyond the hills, men were riding hard. Men who would follow a limping girl's tracks straight to his gate. Eli Blackthorne had made peace with living alone, had buried his guns beneath the floorboards, and sworn never to draw iron again. But as he listened to her labored breathing, behind him and the coyotes calling like prophets in the dark, he knew something with grim certainty. By helping her, he had invited the storm. And tomorrow, trouble would come knocking. The night stretched long and restless. Eli sat by the table, the lamplight painting shadows across his face, while the girl Clara, as she had murmured, slept fitfully on his bedroll. Every so often she cried out in her dreams, flinching as though someone were striking her. Eli's fist tightened around the tin cup in his hands, the fire inside him rising with each broken sound she made. He told himself he didn't want to know her story, that her past wasn't his concern. But in truth, he already knew the shape of it. Men chasing a lone woman across the desert never meant anything good. By dawn, Clara stirred awake. The first rays of light slipped through the cracks in the shutters, falling across her face. Her eyes blinked open, wide and fearful, as though waking in a stranger's home was itself another kind of danger. "You're safe," Eli said quietly, pulling his chair closer. His voice was steady, though he wasn't sure he believed his own words. For now. Her gaze darted around the small cabin, at the iron stove in the corner, the saddle leaning by the wall, the rifle resting above the hearth. Finally, her eyes fixed on him. She frowned slightly, as though seeing him clearly for the first time, the long black hair falling loose down his back, the tribal beads and turquoise amulet resting against his bare chest. "You're not like the others," she whispered. Eli's lips twitched in something almost like a smile. "That depends which others you mean." She tried to sit up, wincing as her ankle protested. He reached out to steady her, but she flinched away. Instinctively, Eli withdrew his hand without comment, though something in his chest tightened. "I shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "If they find me, they'll—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "I've caused you enough risk already." "You'd have bled out on the trail if I left you there," Eli replied. His tone was blunt, but there was a quiet conviction beneath it. "So don't waste time apologizing." Clara looked down at her bandaged ankle, her fingers brushing the cloth he had wrapped. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them, broken only by the wind rattling the shutters. Then she spoke, her voice soft, almost ashamed. "They're bounty men," she said. "They ride under a man named Silas Creed. He runs the mines outside Deadwood, owns the sheriff, too. For all anyone can prove, my brother worked for him. Until he uncovered something he shouldn't have. Silas had him killed. And me," her voice cracked, "I saw it, I ran. And now Creed wants me silenced." Eli leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. He knew the name Silas Creed all too well. Men like him grew fat off other men's suffering, bleeding the land dry with greed and violence. Eli had crossed paths with his kind before, and he bore scars because of it. "So you're running from a man with half this territory in his pocket," Eli said, his tone hard. "And you came stumbling to my door." Her hazel eyes filled with tears, though she tried to blink them back. "I didn't know where else to go. I just kept running." Eli studied her for a long moment. He had lived by one rule since he buried his guns: stay clear of other people's wars. But the fire in Clara's eyes, the same fire he had once carried when everything he loved was stripped away, unsettled him. It stirred embers he thought he had let die. "You'll rest here until you can walk," Eli said finally. "After that, we'll see." Relief flickered across her face, mingled with something like gratitude. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words were drowned out by the sound of distant hoofbeats. Both of them froze. Eli's instincts sharpened, every muscle tightening like a coiled spring. He rose silently, crossing to the window. Through a slit in the shutters, he saw them, dark figures on horseback cresting the ridge, the morning sun glinting off their rifles. At least 4 riders, maybe more, moving slow, deliberate, like hounds. Closing on a scent, Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Her breath came in ragged bursts. "They've found me." Eli turned from the window, his long hair falling across his shoulders as his jaw set like stone. He had tried to leave violence behind, but it was standing at his doorstep now, armed and waiting. His gaze fell to the floorboards near the hearth. Where the earth concealed the weapons he had sworn never to use again, trouble hadn't just knocked. It was riding straight toward them. And Eli Blackthorne had a choice to make. The hoofbeats grew louder, rattling through the canyon like distant thunder. Eli Blackthorne stood motionless by the window, every nerve sharpened, eyes narrowed against the morning glare. Outside, 4 riders crept down the ridge with the precision of wolves circling prey. Their rifles gleamed, their long dusters billowing with the wind. Eli had no doubt who sent them. Silas Creed never wasted time when blood needed spilling. Behind him, Clara pressed her back against the wall, trembling so hard he could hear her breaths breaking in the silence. She hugged her knees, her bandaged ankle jutting awkwardly from her torn skirts. "It's them," she whispered hoarsely. "I told you they wouldn't stop." Eli raised a hand, silencing her. His long black hair fell forward, shadowing the scar across his cheek. He moved with the quiet grace of a hunter as he knelt near the hearth. With one swift motion, he pulled up the loose board and reached inside. When his hand emerged, it held a revolver wrapped in oiled cloth, a weapon he had sworn never to touch again. The weight was familiar, a burden and a comfort both. The riders slowed as they reached his gate. One dismounted, a stocky man with a red bandana tied around his neck. He swaggered forward, spitting into the dirt, his spurs jingling with each step. The others stayed mounted, rifles angled casually. Though their eyes swept the cabin with predatory focus, a fist slammed against the wooden door. "Blackthorne." The voice outside was coarse, full of swagger. "We know she's in there. Hand her over and we'll ride out peaceful. No need for anyone to get hurt." Eli set the revolver on the table but didn't reach for it yet. He opened the door slowly, stepping into the morning light bare-chested, his muscles taut beneath the sun, tribal necklace catching the glow. His expression was cold, unreadable. The stocky rider squinted at him. Well, thought you'd gone soft, Blackthorne. Didn't figure you for harboring fugitives." Eli's voice was calm, steady as bedrock. "There's nobody here who belongs to you." The man sneered, glancing back at his companions. "That so? Funny thing is, we tracked her footprints straight to this gate. Silas Creed don't take kindly to folks lying to him." From inside the cabin, a floorboard creaked. Clara's sharp intake of breath betrayed her hiding place. The rider's grin widened like a snake bearing fangs. "There she is," he said, his voice low and hungry. "Hand her over, Blackthorne. Creed wants her alive. You interfere, you'll end up the same as her brother face down in the dirt." Eli's jaw tightened, a storm brewing in his eyes. He remembered the day he'd sworn to leave violence behind, the graves he'd dug, the blood he'd washed from his hands. But looking into Clara's terrified eyes through the crack of the door, he knew he couldn't stand aside. Not this time. He stepped forward until he stood nose to nose with the stocky man. His voice dropped into a growl. "Tell Creed if he wants her, he can ride down here himself. Until then, you best turn your horses around." The man laughed, ugly and sharp. "You think 4 rifles can't bring you down? You ain't untouchable, Blackthorne." The mounted riders shifted, hands tightening on their triggers. Dust swirled at their horses' hooves. The tension was a taut wire, ready to snap. Eli's hand twitched near the revolver at his side. "You can ride out alive," he said evenly, "or you can ride out with bodies strapped to your saddles. Your choice." For a heartbeat, silence held the canyon still. Even the wind seemed to hush. Then the stocky man spat again, his grin curdling into a snarl. "You've just made yourself an enemy, Blackthorne," he spat. He jerked his head at the riders. "We'll be back with Creed himself." The men wheeled their horses, dust pluming behind them as they thundered back toward the ridge. Eli watched them go, his body rigid, every muscle coiled tight. He knew they weren't bluffing. Creed wouldn't forgive defiance. Next time, it wouldn't be 4 riders, it would be 20. Maybe more. When the sound of hoofbeats finally faded, Eli stepped back inside. Clara sat rigid against the wall, her face pale, her hands clasped tight. "You should have let them take me," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "Now they'll come for you too." Eli holstered the revolver, the decision already carved into his heart. "Then we'll face them together." But even as he spoke, he felt the weight of what he had done. Trouble wasn't just knocking anymore. It was preparing to burn his world to the ground. The cabin felt smaller after the riders left, the silence pressing against its walls like an unseen weight. Clara sat with her back to the hearth, her fingers twisting the hem of her torn skirt, eyes wide with fear. Eli paced the floor, long, hair brushing his shoulders, the turquoise beads at his neck catching the faint glow of the lamp. His body moved with the restless energy of a man who knew war was coming but hadn't yet chosen the battlefield. "They'll bring Creed," Clara said at last, her voice a thin whisper. "When he comes, there'll be no stopping him." Eli stopped pacing and turned to her, his bronze chest rising and falling with controlled breath. "There's always stopping a man. Just depends what you're willing to pay." Her eyes searched his, desperate. "You don't understand. Silas Creed owns this land, owns the law. He's got half the town in his pocket. Men like him don't fall." Eli's scarred face hardened. "Every man falls. Question is how long he can stand before he does." The words hung heavy, but Eli knew she was right about one thing. Creed wouldn't let this go. Already the dust trail from the riders would be winding back toward Deadwood, carrying the news that Eli Blackthorne had defied him. And Creed's pride was as dangerous as his guns. By midday, the sound of hoofbeats returned louder this time, deeper, like a storm rolling across the plains. Eli stepped outside, the desert sun glaring off his skin, and his jaw clenched at what he saw. Not 4 riders, not 6. A dozen men, armed with rifles and shotguns, rode hard into his yard. At their head was Silas Creed himself. Creed was a broad man with a black coat that flapped against his legs as he rode. His wide-brimmed hat shaded eyes as cold and flat as a rattler's. His beard was streaked with gray, but his presence was iron-strong, a man used to giving orders and never hearing no. The riders fanned out, horses snorting, hooves tearing the dry earth. Dust filled the air, choking the space between the cabin and the men who came to burn it down. "Blackthorne." Creed's voice boomed, low and dangerous, echoing against the canyon walls. He reined in his horse just short of the porch, his gloved hand resting casually on the silver grip of his revolver. "I hear you've taken in something that belongs to me." Eli stood bare-chested in the sun, long black hair falling over his shoulders, turquoise and bone necklace gleaming like fire against his bronzed skin. He didn't flinch beneath Creed's gaze. "She doesn't belong to you or to anyone." A murmur rippled through the riders. Creed's thin smile deepened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That girl's seen something she shouldn't. You know how this works, Blackthorne. You hand her over, and maybe I forget you stood in my way. Keep her, and you're declaring war on me." From the cabin doorway, Clara appeared, leaning heavily against the frame, her injured ankle trembling under her weight. Her hazel eyes burned with defiance, though her body quivered with fear. "You killed my brother," she shouted, her voice cracking. "I won't be silenced." Creed's cold eyes slid to her, and his smile vanished. "Girl, you should have kept your mouth shut." He looked back at Eli. "Last chance, Blackthorne. You got no stake in this. Step aside." Eli's jaw tightened. He could feel every gaze on him, the riders shifting, hands twitching near their triggers, the weight of Clara's hope heavy behind him. He thought of the years he'd spent burying his past, burying his guns, trying to live without blood. But some choices couldn't be run from. "I've buried enough innocence," Eli said, his voice like iron. "You'll not have this one." The words struck the air like a gunshot. Silence followed, thick and deadly. Creed's hand flexed on the grip of his revolver. The riders shifted, rifles lowering just slightly. Then Creed leaned forward in his saddle, his voice a hiss sharp as a snake strike. "So be it. You've chosen your grave, Blackthorn. I'll give you until sundown to hand her over. After that, I'll burn this cabin to the ground and scatter your bones in the dust." He snapped the reins, wheeling his horse, and his men followed. Dust clouded the yard, choking the sunlight as they thundered back toward the ridge. Eli stood unmoving, fists clenched at his sides until the sound of hooves faded into silence again. Behind him, Clara's breath shook. "You should have given me up," she whispered. "Now you'll die for me." Eli turned, his scarred face calm but resolute. "No, Clara. If I fall, it won't be for you. It'll be for something bigger. Creed's had this land under his boot long enough. Maybe it's time someone stood up." Her eyes filled with tears, not of fear this time, but of something Eli couldn't yet name. Outside, the sun burned high in the sky, marking the slow crawl toward sundown. Toward blood. The sun climbed higher, dragging the heat across the canyon until the earth itself seemed to pulse with it. Inside the cabin, silence reigned. Clara sat at the table, her ankle propped on a stool, hands twisting nervously in her lap. Eli crouched near the hearth, pulling up the floorboards one by one. Dust rose with each lift, and beneath them lay the relics of a life he had sworn off. A second revolver, a Winchester rifle, and a knife sheathed in worn leather. Clara's voice broke the silence. "You were ready for this," she said softly. Eli looked up, his long black hair falling into his face. "No, I was ready never to need these again. But some trouble doesn't leave a man choice." He placed the rifle on the table, checking its sights, his hands steady as stone. Clara flinched at the sound of the weapon clicking, but her gaze lingered on him, caught between awe and fear. There was something about him, his scars, his silence, that told her he had lived through storms worse than most men could imagine. "They'll be back at sundown," she whispered. "They always make good on their threats." Eli poured water into a tin cup and slid it toward her. "Then we use the time we have." Clara hesitated, then leaned forward, her eyes shining in the dim light. "There's something you should know. Something Silas Creed doesn't want anyone to learn." "My brother!" She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "He kept records, proof of what Creed was doing at the mines. Not just stealing gold from his own men, but poisoning the water, driving families off their land so he could claim it. My brother hid those records in a ledger. Before he—" Her voice faltered. "Before he was killed, he made me swear I'd get them to someone who could bring Creed down." Eli's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "And where's this ledger now?" Her gaze dropped to the table. "Hidden in Deadwood. I barely escaped with my life before Creed's men caught my trail. If I can get it to the right hands, maybe Judge Marlowe in Cheyenne Creed could finally be tried. That's why he's after me. He can't afford for the truth to spread." Eli leaned back, the firelight flickering across his scarred face. The stakes were clearer now. This wasn't just a girl running for her life. This was a fight for something bigger, for justice in a land where men like Creed thought they were untouchable. "You mean to say you've got a way to bring him down without guns?" Eli said slowly. Clara nodded. "But I can't get there. Alone. I can't even walk straight." For a long moment, Eli said nothing. He looked at the rifle on the table, then at the horizon through the window where the sun burned relentlessly, inching toward its fall. He had spent years avoiding causes, burying the part of him that once fought for more than survival. But here it was again, rising from the dust in the form of a wounded woman with fire in her eyes. He finally spoke, his voice low. "Then we make it through sundown. After that, I'll see you to Cheyenne myself." Clara's lips parted in surprise, but before she could answer, a distant sound split the silence, the long, low howl of a coyote. Eli stiffened, listening. It wasn't just a coyote. He knew the land too well. It was a signal, a call between riders hidden in the hills. "They're closer than I thought," Eli muttered. He crossed to the window, scanning the ridges. Already, faint specks of movement stirred against the horizon. Creed's men weren't waiting until sundown after. They were tightening the noose early. Clara gripped the edge of the table. "What do we do?" Eli's scarred face turned toward her, hard and steady, the face of a man who had already accepted the fight. "We make them bleed for every step they take." He set the rifle against his shoulder, checked the revolvers, and slipped the knife into his belt. The warrior he had buried for so long was awake again, alive in his stance, in the fire burning behind his dark eyes. Outside, the wind picked up, swirling dust around the cabin like a warning. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first crack of gunfire. And as the sun slid lower, casting long shadows across the desert floor, Eli Blackthorne knew the night would decide everything, whether he and Clara walked away alive, or whether their names would be swallowed by the dust of Deadwood Canyon forever. The night cracked open with gunfire. Elin had barely finished whispering to Mary to stay low when the first bullet splintered through the cabin wall, sending shards of wood raining over them. He shoved her down behind the bed and sprang to his feet, muscles rippling as he grabbed the old Winchester leaning in the corner. The metallic click of the lever echoed in the small room. His long black hair spilled over his shoulders, wild in the firelight, and his eyes burned with the steel of a man who had fought battles before. Outside, the riders shouted, their voices carrying hatred and hunger for violence. Hooves thundered in the dirt as Silas Creed's men circled, firing shots to rattle him. The cabin shook under the barrage, but Elin stood firm, his bare chest gleaming with sweat, tribal necklace glinting like a talisman of strength. "Stay quiet," he breathed to Mary, his voice steady even as the bullets whined through the night. "Trust me." She clutched the pistol to her chest, her breath shallow, tears streaking her soot-smudged cheeks. Every sound seemed to grow louder. The creak of the cabin beams, the crackle of the fire, the horses snorting just outside. Fear pressed in like the walls themselves were shrinking. Then Elin moved. He threw the door open with a roar and fired into the night. The rifle kicked against his shoulder as the blast lit up the yard, a streak of flame against the black sky. One rider toppled from his horse, screaming. The others scattered for cover, cursing into the wind. "Elin!" Mary cried out, but he was already in motion, reloading with lightning speed, his hair flying as he ducked behind the cabin door frame. Bullets chewed the wood near his head, dust and splinters exploding against his skin. He felt the sting of one grazing his shoulder, hot and sharp, but he didn't falter. The air grew thick with smoke and gunpowder. The horses whinnied in panic, hooves tearing up the dirt as Creed's men regrouped. Elin could see their torches flickering, their shadows weaving like devils across the desert ground. "Burn him out." Creed's voice thundered from the dark. Elin's stomach turned cold. Fire. That was their answer. Mary gasped, her voice trembling from behind the bed. "They'll kill us." "Not if I kill them first," Elin muttered, jaw tight. He darted to the window, aimed, and squeezed the trigger. Another man fell, and the gunfire momentarily faltered. But then flames licked against the outer wall as a torch struck. Smoke began seeping inside, curling above the rafters. Mary coughed, covering her mouth. "We can't stay." Elin's mind raced. He could fight until the bullets ran out. He could charge out into the yard, cut down as many as possible before they overwhelmed him. But the image of Mary, trembling and weak with her injured ankle, pierced through his warrior instincts. She was no fighter, and he had given her his word. Fire spread quickly, sparks spitting into the night. The cabin walls groaned under the heat. He grabbed Mary's hand and pulled her to her feet. "Come, there's another way." She limped after him as he pushed open a trapdoor in the floor, a hidden crawl space used by the cabin's last owner to store food. Narrow, cramped, but it led out beneath the back wall. The roar of the fire above them grew deafening as they crawled through the dirt, the smoke chasing them like a beast. Mary wheezed with every movement, her ankle slowing her, but Elin never let go of her hand. His necklace rattled against his chest as he dragged her forward, sweat dripping into the soiled out at last. They spilled out into the cool night air, coughing and gasping. Behind them, the cabin blazed, the flames devouring it whole, sending sparks into the starry sky, but Creed's men weren't finished. "Over here!" a rider shouted, spotting them in the firelight. Elin pulled Mary into the shadows of a mesquite tree, pressing her close to him. His rifle was nearly empty. His muscles ached, his shoulder burned, and still they came dark shapes on horseback, closing in, weapons glinting. For the first time that night, he wondered if they would make it out alive. The night had burned itself out, leaving the cabin nothing but a blackened skeleton against the pale blush of dawn. Smoke rose in thin, tired spirals, curling over the prairie as if the earth itself sighed after all it had endured. The air was thick with the scent of ash, gunpowder, and blood and iron tang that clung to the back of the throat dot inside the ruins. Tahu still stood. His bare chest was streaked with soot and blood, his turquoise and bone jewelry dulled by grime, yet his eyes burned like coals that refused to die. The rifle in his hands was empty, but his spirit was not. He had fought until there was nothing left to give, each bullet carving a warning into the night. "You will not take her. You will not break me." At his feet, the young woman stirred. Her ankle was still bound, but she had endured through the long hours, crouched low while fire and fury reigned around them. Now, as she raised her eyes to him, there was something new in her gaze, not just fear, but faith. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tahu looked at her for a long moment, then turned toward the horizon. "No," he said, softly, shaking his head. "We saved each other." The prairie was littered with silence where once there had been war cries and gunshots. A few of Silas Creed's men still lay scattered, broken in the dirt, their horses long gone. The outlaw himself had fled into the darkness after taking a wound, his black coat trailing behind him like a shadow swallowed by night. Tahu knew Creed would return men like him always did, but for now, the land was theirs. The woman limped to his side, her hand brushing the warrior's soot-streaked arm. "What happens now?" she asked, her eyes scanning the ruin of what had once been shelter. Tahu's gaze lingered on the smoldering ashes of the cabin, the home he had built with his own hands. It was gone, reduced to cinders, yet he did not mourn the wood and stone. He had stood before death and chosen life, not for himself alone, but for the fragile soul who now leaned on him. He tightened his jaw, his long black hair stirring in the cool morning wind. "Now," he said, "we rebuild. Not here, not with walls of timber, but with something stronger. Trust, loyalty. The fire may have taken the house, but it cannot take who we are." She studied him, the quiet resolve etched into his features, and nodded. For the first time in days, a faint smile broke across her tired face. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, painted gold by the rising sun. Somewhere out there lay danger still, but also hope, a place where the two of them could walk without fear, where her limp would not define her and his past would not chain him. Tahu reached down, offering his strong, calloused hand. She took. And without hesitation, as they walked away from the charred wreckage, the wind carried with it the last sighs of smoke. Every step forward was slow, her injury made sure of that, but each step was steady, guided by the warrior who had chosen not to turn away from a stranger in need. The prairie would remember this night. The earth always remembered when men spilled blood upon it, but so too would it remember the defiance of one warrior and one wounded woman who chose to rise from the ashes together. And though trouble had knocked on his door, though fire had consumed his home, Tahu's spirit was unbroken. He was a man forged not of walls or weapons, but of the fire within a fire that no enemy could extinguish. The horizon blazed bright, and for the first time in a long while, the warrior and the young woman walked not into danger, but into the promise of a new day.